we are going to be looking at that same story, the story of Jesus walking on water. But just before we get there, I wonder if you've heard the story about the two friends who are going for a walk by the lake. And one of the friends has got his dog with them. They're out for a dog walk. And as they walk along, he picks up a stick and he throws it for the dog. And before too long, he misthrows the stick and it flies out into the lake. And his dog runs across the surface of the lake, picks up the stick and runs back and puts it at his feet. And he pauses and he tries it again. The stick lands in the lake, the dog runs across the surface of the lake, picks up the stick, runs back again, drops it at his feet. So he nudges his friend, he says, "Hey, watch this." And he throws the stick again, and the dog runs across the surface of the water, grabs the stick, brings it back, drops it at his feet, and he says, "Did you notice that?" And his friend says, "Yeah, your dog can't swim." Now, that's not purely a spurious joke, as we'll see later, because actually, sometimes when we talk about the miracles of Jesus, I don't know if you have had this experience. When I first became a Christian, I was 14, and up until that point, when I'd heard stories about Jesus, they were always filed under fairy stories in my head. They were filed in the same category. So Noah's Ark sat alongside, Hans Christian Andersen, Hansel and Gretel, like a nice story that I was told when I was a kid. That's where it sat in my head. And when I became a Christian, I started to wrestle with, do I really believe this? And we can struggle with belief. And I still have people ask me sometimes, "Oh, you don't believe all that miracle stuff, do you?" And it got me thinking, does anyone know what this animal is here? Shout it out if you do. Okay, this is called a peacock spider. Perhaps you can see why. This spider, this is the male, which is the colourful one, because he has to impress the female. This spider does an entire dance routine in which most of the time you can't see that colourful fan. It kind of pops up, and it looks like, those guys who signal for planes to land at small airports. He looks like one of those. He's going like this with his arms and his legs, and this thing changes colour and fans around iridescent. It's the most incredible spider. It's about 2 centimetres across, this thing. You could totally miss it, even if you went to Western Australia where it lives. You could totally miss it, but it does this entire routine. This incredibly complex spider. If we're on spiders as well, there's another spider called the golden wheel spider, which can't run fast enough to get away from the wasps that feed on it. So if it's attacked, it lives in the sand dunes of Namibia. It rolls its legs up, like dead spiders that you might have seen, and it rolls down the sand dunes, spins around 44 times a second. If your car wheels spun around that fast, you'd be going about 350 kilometers an hour. These are incredible miracles of creation. What's this? What's this picture? A limpet. Okay, so as humans, we have been trying for millennia to make the strongest materials possible. You've got iron and bronze, and then, you go a bit further, we get steel, and now people are working on materials like Kevlar. Did you know that the teeth of a limpet that hold it to a rock are stronger than Kevlar? They're stronger than basically any material we know apart from carbon fibre. The material that holds limpets onto a rock. That's why, if you don't knock it before it locks on, you will never prise a limpet off. Its teeth are stronger than Kevlar or steel. Just phenomenal. This is just the wonder of God's creation. Anyone here wear bifocals? Do you know God got there first? This fish here is called Anableps anableps. It lives in mangrove swamps, and it needs to see underwater and over water to keep track of both prey and predators. And that little line there with the water on it kind of slightly masks the fact there's a similar line across its eyes, and its upper eyes are focused on seeing in air and have a filter that means they see better with green light, and the lower half of its eyes are better at seeing with the refractive index of water and see better in yellow light. Just the incredible creation that God has made there. These are phenomenal things. Or we could look at, this is one of my favourite places. I'd love to go there one day. Perhaps some of you have been there. The Okavango Delta, an inland delta. You've got the Kalahari Desert on one side. You've got rain that falls hundreds of miles away, further north in Africa, which finds its way down through rivers into this delta and brings life to a desert and holds back the desertification. And particularly when it's in flood, you see this place going from being a parched desert to suddenly this wonderful oasis of life with elephants swimming because there's so much water there. The wonder of God's creation is all around us. And sometimes we're a bit like the friend who says, oh, your dog can't swim. We can choose to shut out the idea that there's a creator who made it all. But it is the logical answer, really, isn't it? I mean, just the immensity of this. Now, I'm not a biologist. I had to ask some friends of mine who are for some of these examples. But those who study creation have a wonderful way of noting incredible things. Now, I sat in a chapel once with a student who was from the Far East. And it was her first time in the chapel. This was when I was at university. And I said, oh, what brought you here? She said, well, I come from China. We don't talk about God there. But when I came here to study astrophysics, I looked at what we were learning and I said, there must be a God. So I'm here to find out about him. This is the response of your dog's walking on water rather than your dog swimming. So back to our story. This is a real story that actually happened. We've actually got 3 eyewitness accounts of it. One of them's told by Matthew. One of them's told by Mark. Mark was told by Peter. So Peter was one of Jesus' disciples. He told Mark his experiences. Mark writes them down. So we've got Mark's account, which is from Peter. And then we've also got John's account. I think John must have been rowing. We'll get to why in a bit. But so Matthew, Peter, and John all recount this story, and they tell the same core story, but they add some of the details that they noticed that they think were important. And that's why I actually really like that we had that dramatization from the point of view of Bartholomew. It reminds us these were real people. Now, I'm sure Bartholomew didn't have a Scottish accent, but there were real people who were really terrified, and some of them would have been seasick because they weren't all fishermen. And they would have been utterly flummoxed that, because as fishermen, they're used to sailing and rowing, and yet they're making no progress against the wind and the waves. So these are real people telling a real story. And I just want to pick up on a couple of things. In addition to being a real story, this is also a really good picture of our lives. Because, the disciples are there in the middle of the lake. They've got halfway, but they are battling. And they must be getting tired. Remember, they've had a hard day already. They've been with Jesus. They've been with a huge crowd of people. That's exhausting. And this crowd was, if you read between the lines, this crowd was hoping at one point to take Jesus by force and make him king. This is not like a restful crowd who all at the end go, thank you very much, Vicar, and walk off to the rest of their day. Like, these guys were a handful. And after a full day of that, Jesus is like, okay, we're going over to the other side. And so they set out in the boat. They're already tired when they leave. And now it's the middle of the night, and they're rowing against the wind and the waves. And they haven't got an outboard motor to help them. So they are really tired. And you know what? Sometimes life feels like that, doesn't it? How many people here have just got back into the routine of school mornings? Okay, a few of you. Some of you may remember it. In our case, wake-up time goes from 8 a.m. to 6 a.m. And, it feels brutal for a minute. Life is full of joy, but actually alarm clocks sometimes feel like they rob it of joy, or obstacles, difficulties, growing to-do lists. Does anyone here have a to-do list that gets longer rather than shorter? Yeah, okay. Like, these things, they can feel like hard going. Life can feel like it's hard going, and it is a slog. And it's not that we're rubbish at life. These disciples, some of them were fishermen, they knew how to row, and yet they're still struggling against the wind and the waves. And that's sometimes what life is like for us. And then Jesus appears. And he must have looked outlandish to them. They are used to the lake. At least certainly some of them are, and probably most of them have at least lived around the lake a bit. Okay, they're used to the lake. They're used to what happens. Things either float, boats, or they sink, people, right? And that swimming wasn't a big thing back then. So that's how things work. And suddenly this figure comes towards them across the lake. And they think it's a ghost. Now, bear in mind that despite the fact that these people are good Jews who believe in one God, there's just a lot of superstition around anywhere, isn't there? And we read that at the time, a lot of people believed that there were ghosts or spirits or hauntings, and they see this figure, and it's like, well, people don't float, boats float, people sink, so it can't be a real person. He seems outlandish to them, out of place and unfamiliar from the world that they're in. And they're terrified. I wonder if you can imagine the kind of fear that they might have had, experiencing something that is totally outside anything they've ever encountered before. But when he draws closer, they find that actually he's no such thing. He's not a ghost, he's not a subject of terror, and he's not a figment of their imagination or a fantasy from a story. He's real. He's real. If we read Peter's account through Mark, we get some little additional details here. When Jesus gets close to the boat, I wonder if we could, maybe let's stick a picture up that might make us think of it. Here we go. As Jesus gets close to the boat and the disciples are there, Matthew tells the story of Peter walking on the water. Peter doesn't choose to tell that bit of the story. Maybe it's humility, I don't know. But Peter mentions that Jesus looked like he was about to walk past. He said he was about to pass them by, and they called out to him. He doesn't force himself into the boat. He drew close, but he didn't push himself on them. But when they welcome him into the boat, then there's an instant change. Very instant. Mark records that immediately the wind and the waves died down. This is where I think John must have been at the oars, because in John's account he said not only did the wind and the waves calm down, but suddenly they found that they had arrived at the shore that they were heading towards. So they'd been stuck in the middle of the lake, rowing against the wind and the waves. They invite Jesus into the boat, and suddenly they arrive. There's an instant change. You'd remember that, wouldn't you, if you'd been the one struggling against the wind and the waves, and suddenly you got there. And yet, they are utterly amazed. Why are they so amazed? On the one hand, they've just seen a double miracle. Jesus has got in the boat, the winds and waves have calmed down, they've arrived at shore, and they've also seen Peter walking on the water. But this wasn't like the first miracle they'd ever seen. As Tom was telling us earlier, they'd just seen Jesus feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. But Peter's take on it, and remember Peter is one of them, so he knows what he's talking about. He says that their hearts were hard. What does he say? Here we are. Jesus climbed into the boat with them and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they hadn't understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. They were in this place where they'd seen some of God's glory through Jesus, but they'd not really twigged the full importance of it. Why? I think sometimes we just get on with life, don't we? We have our little sphere of life that we understand and we control, and something comes from outside, you wonder at it, but then you just park it off there because it doesn't fit in your framework. And this is the challenge the disciples face. And so Jesus lands the message really firmly with them. And this time they realize, and just as Tom recounted in his retelling, they say, truly you are the Son of God. Look, we're in the same position sometimes. Our hearts struggle to understand that the God who made anableps, and the limpet teeth, and the spider that rolls down a sand dune 44 times a second, we struggle to believe that there's really this loving creator who wants to interact with us in our ordinary humdrum lives that feature, IT systems that you get locked out of. That was Caroline's experience this week. Or bills that need paying. Or medical difficulties that seem very mundane. Jesus is in that world. He is as real as, if not more real than that world. Jesus can feed 5,000 people with a child's lunch because he's the Lord of food and drink and he's the Lord of bodies and hunger. And Jesus can walk on water because he's the Lord of the laws of physics and he's the Lord of the water. He made it. There's that wonderful hymn, some of you will know, Be Still My Soul. And it has this line in it, Be still my soul, the wind and waves still know his voice who ruled them while he dwelt below. So they get it and they say, you are the Son of God. And that same challenge is there for us today. Do we get it? Do we look at the world around us with all of its beauty and creation and say, your dog can't swim? Or do we look at it and say, truly, Jesus, you are the Son of God? Our lives feel ordinary, and yet they are full of wonder. The beauty of sunrises, Meteor showers. Did anyone see the Perseids at the end of August? We lay out, we were on holiday in Dorset, we lay out on the patio outside this little cottage, and we looked up. We must have seen, 6 or 7 just bright streaks. They kind of almost sear across your eyeballs if you catch a really good one, don't they? Just the beauty of that. We've recently had an influx of bumblebees. One of our plants in our garden has flourished, and the bees love it, and suddenly you can hear them, and you see the little wings, and you think, how does that even work? How do these wings work? Or if you maybe have had the privilege of seeing a baby's heartbeat in the womb as a sonographer, or maybe your own child or a friend's. But not just that, like the inexplicable, sort of intangible joy that you get as you sit down with a friend and you talk heart to heart. Like there's something there that we can't just explain with science. There's something there that is a fingerprint of the Creator. The joy of singing together. Why is it we love singing? Do you know, people who have no faith in God still sometimes find they love singing even Christian songs because there's something about singing together. It's something God's put in us. Are we going to see the fingerprints of God and say, surely you are the Son of God? Or are we going to say your dog can't swim? We can let Jesus pass us by, like he nearly passed by that boat full of disciples. We can be so terrified because God is like an unknown thing to us, and it doesn't fit within what we understand. Or we can dismiss him to the realm of ghost stories or fairy stories, as I did as a child as well. But then we will keep struggling against the wind and the waves on our own. Or we can invite him into the boat. Now, I want to be clear, inviting Jesus into your life doesn't mean that suddenly everything becomes easy. Absolutely not. But some things do become easier, do you know? And you don't face anything alone. That's the really key thing. You don't face anything alone. Yesterday, I had the privilege of going to a celebration of 10 years of Christians Against Poverty in the city of Oxford. So the charity's been going longer, but in Oxford, the Oxford Central Debt Centre has been going for 10 years now. And among other things, a number of people who had been helped by the charity came up on stage with boards in front of them. And on one side, they had written their life before engaging with Christians Against Poverty. And on the other side, they'd written what it was like afterwards. It was so powerful. And not just that they had the courage to stand up in front of people and show it, but every single one of those boards showed just a lifting off of anxiety about money and about life. That was great. But some of them showed something more. Some of them also referred to a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of feeling whole. One of the ladies just had broken on one side before she came to Christians Against Poverty. On the other side, there were a number of adjectives. The one that struck me was wholeness. Those were the ones who didn't just receive debt help, but also then found church, and through church found Jesus and invited him into their life. And it utterly transformed their life, far more than just helping them to sort their finances. Do you know, Jesus wants to come into your boat. Is he in your boat? If not, why not ask him in? And for those of us where Jesus is firmly in our boat, I guess there's another part of this story that applies to us. Because Peter is a follower of Jesus already. But when he sees Jesus coming, he doesn't simply wait for Jesus to get in the boat, but he thinks, I am going to test this in faith. And so he calls out to Jesus and he says, if this is you, ask me to do something impossible in your name. He knows it's impossible to walk on water. He has seen again and again that it's impossible to walk on water. You had to jump out of the boat and walk to shore through, wading through the water, because you couldn't pull your boat all the way up all the time, certainly not with you in it. So you'd get out and you'd walk and you'd wade and pull the boat after you. So he knows that people don't walk on water, and yet he sees Jesus doing it and he says, if you do it, call me to do it and I will do it. And I wonder if for some of us that's God's call to us this morning. We read the scriptures and we see in them a quality of life with God in which people hear what God says to them and are obedient, in which people see, well, God is like this and the world is like this, so I want to be part of seeing the world change to be more like God. And they say, if this is you, ask me to do the impossible. And so I want to challenge you today. If you say, I know Jesus is in the boat, I know that I've asked him into my life, what is he calling you to do that is impossible? Or do you even need to ask him, Jesus, I know my faith is real, so ask me to do something that's impossible in my own strength, and I'll do it. In just a second, we're going to break for refreshments. And I just want to leave us with some questions. Sometimes it's helpful to put yourself in a picture, isn't it? And if this boat is a metaphor of our lives, halfway across the lake, rowing against the waves, where's Jesus in your life? Is he walking along, making himself known, but perhaps about to pass by? Is he in the boat? Are you at that stage that Peter was at of saying, I'm going to say it, Jesus, ask me to come across the water to you? Are you walking? Are you floating? Are you beginning to doubt and beginning to sink? Where are you in that picture? And how do you feel about that? Why not talk with some other people over refreshments in just a second about that? And secondly, perhaps that all gets a little bit intense, or maybe you're just full of the joys of things that you've seen over the summer. But what have you seen or experienced in recent weeks that shows the wonder of creation to you? Where are the fingerprints of God that you've seen over the summer? Why not share some of those and encourage each other? So what we're going to do now, we're going to break until I think it's about 1:45. The children are going to come back in and they're going to give us their surprise. So until then, it'd be 1:45, 10 to or something like that. Until then, why not go over to the refreshments table? I'm just going to pray before we do, so don't run just yet. Go over to the refreshments table, grab a cup of coffee or tea, a drink, a bit of cake. Sit down with some people who you know, some people you came with, or somebody you've never met before, and just talk over some of these questions. Where is Jesus in your life? And where have you seen the fingerprints of God in recent weeks? Let's just pray, and then we'll break for these refreshments. Lord Jesus, who walked on water, please give us eyes of faith and trust to believe what's been written about you and to apply it to our lives. God, let us be those who see what's really going on, not those who cast it in terms of what we can already understand. Jesus, I pray if there's anyone here this morning who hasn't asked you into their lives, God, would you draw close to them again today? And Jesus, if you're stirring adventures of faith in us, I pray that you would give us the conviction to act on it, to speak that question of faith. Is this what you want? Call me to you. And I pray that you'd speak in answer. We ask it in the name of Jesus, the Son of God, the Lord of the wind and the waves, the Lord of physics, the Lord of creation, the Lord of our lives. Amen.